Imagine 1815, while armies clashed at Waterloo and the fate of all Europe depended on minutes, a man crosses the English Channel with news that no one else had. He carries not gold, not weapons, but information, and this information, if used at the right time, can transform a bank into a dynasty, or completely destroy your reputation. This is where the rumor that has spanned centuries was born. It is alleged that Nathan Rothschild used advance news of Napoleon's defeat to profit almost single-handedly from the market chaos. A story so dramatic that it refuses to die even when the facts say otherwise. But what's most impressive, it's not a rumor. It is what did this rumor do to the Rothschild family? Because, whether you like them or not, what happened in the days after Waterloo helped build the myth of the most powerful bank of the 19th century. And the best part, there's a twist in this story that almost nobody knows about. It's such an absurd twist that, when you understand it, you'll realize that the financial world is much more psychological than logical. If you enjoy true stories that seem straight out of a movie, take advantage of this opportunity to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because today we're going back to the beginning of the 19th century and witnessing the exact moment when a family transformed a simple rumor into the greatest financial leap in modern history. Imagine Europe plunged into the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars. Armies marching, borders shifting, and the entire continent's economy breathing fear. Now imagine London, the nerve center of finance, desperately awaiting a single piece of news. Did Napoleon win, or did Napoleon fall? This answer would decide the fate of empires, markets, and entire fortunes. And it was precisely in this scenario that a young banker, Nathan Rothschild, realized something that no one else saw. When the world is in chaos, information becomes absolute power. While most merchants relied on slow messengers and outdated newspapers, the Rothschilds had what everyone dreamed of, a network of informants faster than any government of the time. Underground couriers, secret agents, messengers on horseback crossing the continent at unprecedented speed. They didn't control armies, but they controlled the information, which at that time was worth more than gunpowder. And so it was that, on the day of the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan received in London the news that would change the world before any other banker. He knew that Napoleon had lost. He knew that Europe was about to breathe a sigh of relief. And he also knew that, when this information reached the market, the value of British bonds would explode. But what did he do next? This is the part of the story that transformed a skilled banker into a legend and a wealthy family into a dynasty that would change the course of the world economy. Nathan Rothschild walked through the London Stock Exchange with the calculatedly neutral expression of a man carrying an explosive secret. He already knew of the British victory at Waterloo, but the market did not. And while everyone frantically speculated about the outcome of the battle, he made the decision that would become one of the most admired and debated financial moves in money history. He started to sell. He sold consolidated bonds, stocks, and holdings as if he were watching England sink at that very moment. The stock market aisles watched in silence. If Rothschild he was selling, something terrible must have happened. Collective psychology did the rest. Other investors imitated the move. Prices plummeted. Silent panic gripped the room. London believed British defeat was certain because Nathan, the best informed man in the country, acted as if it were true. But that was the genius of it. He knew exactly what he was doing. When prices hit rock bottom, when fear finally reached its limit, he changed positions like a general flipping the board. His agents began to buy everything: government bonds, devalued stocks, strategic holdings. It was as if he were picking up diamonds scattered on the floor by panicked investors. And a few minutes later, the real rumor finally reached the city: Napoleon was defeated. England won. The market exploded upwards, the bonds he had bought for pennies skyrocketed in value. And, on that single day, the Rothschild family cemented a reputation that echoed throughout Europe. They didn't follow the market, they moved the market. It was the precise moment when the dynasty ceased to be merely wealthy and became an invisible force that would shape governments, wars, and central banks for generations. The London Stock Exchange was in an almost hypnotic state that morning. The silent panic caused by Nathan's strategy still hung in the air, and no one dared to contradict what seemed to be an inevitable fate. But what few understood was that the Rothschilds' power lay not only in privileged information, but in their ability to orchestrating collective emotions in markets as sensitive as that of 1815. Fear and hope were worth more than gold. And Nathan knew how to play those two notes better than any European banker of the time. When Wellington's victory was finally confirmed, the city erupted in ecstasy. Investors who had sold everything watched helplessly as prices rose as quickly as they had plummeted. And while the crowd tried to buy back what they had lost, the Rothschild family agents remained impassive, having already secured their positions. For many, this episode became definitive proof that the Rothschilds knew invisible mechanisms, following routes where common logic could not reach. It was here that the perception was born that they were capable not only of anticipating history, but, in a way, of influencing its course. This episode also revealed something even more powerful: the impact of information asymmetry. The family wasn't omniscient, they didn't control every detail. They simply had access that no one else had: fast messengers, logistical networks, diplomats, merchants scattered throughout Europe. And, above all, they had the emotional discipline to act when everyone else lost their heads. At that time, that already seemed almost supernatural. Today, it would be described as absolute mastery of market behavior. And while London tried to cope with the damage and public humiliation of having been deceived by its own fears, the Rothschild family quietly expanded its network. That hadn't just been a brilliant move. It had been a signal warning to kings, generals, and finance ministers. In the new economic order that emerged after the fall of Napoleon, military power would remain important, but financial power, it was beginning to decide the future of empires. Napoleon's defeat did not merely reorganize territories, it reorganized the flow of money. Governments devastated by war needed to rebuild, pay off armies, stabilize currencies, and negotiate debts that seemed impossible to honor. And guess who was exactly in the right place, with the right capital, at the right time? The Rothschild family. While generals discussed maps, they discussed interest rates. While European courts tried to reorganize political power, they reorganized the financial power, silent but decisive. Nathan Rothschild, now viewed with both suspicion and fascination, pledged to finance British Reconstruction while simultaneously supporting governments that, until weeks before, had been at war with each other. It was a risky but brilliant move. By lending to both sides of post-Napoleonic Europe, the family positioned itself as the indispensable bridge. No one could become stable without them. It was during this period that the expression "the Rothschilds control the gold in Europe" began to appear in newspapers, always with a mixture of admiration and fear. What's most impressive is that their real power wasn't in the money itself, but in speed of information. Napoleon had revolutionized warfare with logistics, the Rothschilds revolutionized finance with communication. Messengers on horseback, fast boats, secret codes, a network so efficient that many governments seemed days behind. In a Europe trying to rebuild stability, whoever arrived first with information not only understood the future, determined the future. And it was precisely at that moment that something deeper began to happen. Kings, chancellors, and ministers realized they were facing a new force. It wasn't an army, it wasn't a revolution. It was a family that could move fortunes between countries in a matter of hours. International politics was beginning to change, and many understood that, from then on, anyone who wanted to govern a country would first need to understand who controlled the credit that kept the country afloat. In the end, post-Napoleonic Europe paved the way for the Rothschilds to transform themselves not only into bankers, but into architects of stability in an era of chaos. And this silent and inevitable evolution prepares the ground for the next chapter, when financial power becomes so great that it gets out of control even of its own creators. As Europe attempted to rebuild, it became clear that the Rothschild family was no longer just a group of successful bankers. They were becoming a parallel institution so organized and efficient that it seemed to have a life of its own. What began as an intelligent network of brothers operating in different countries transformed into something much larger, an international financial machine capable of sustaining entire governments, or bringing them to their knees. Each brother was responsible for a center of power: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. Together, they formed a system that functioned as a single organism, an organism that transcended borders, political crises, and even rivalries between kingdoms. While European diplomats needed weeks to negotiate treaties, the Rothschilds needed only a code sent by messenger to move millions. It was the birth of what many today would call shadow banking system, not in the modern sense, but in the most primitive and pure sense, capital flowing outside of traditional power structures. And the issue that began to trouble Europe was the same one that troubles any established power: who controls these men? Because, while governments faced elections, protests, and bureaucracies, the family operated with almost absolute freedom. They didn't have to answer to parliamentarians, they didn't answer to kings, they didn't follow campaign schedules. They only followed what they mastered better than anyone else: calculation, speed, and influence. It was at this point that stories began to emerge, some true, others exaggerated, about the Rothschilds' ability to predict collapses, steer markets, and even influence diplomatic decisions. Many Europeans looked at the family with gratitude, others, with fear. After all, when a group controls information, credit, gold transport, and messenger networks, it also controls the pace of history. And while the growing influence was a source of admiration, it also set the stage for an inevitable danger: the greater the power, the greater the risk that someone would try to challenge it. And this silent, growing risk is precisely what paves the way for the next chapter, when the family discovers that not all strength is invincible. With the family dominating information flows, credit networks, and even the speed at which news traveled across the continent, it wasn't long before governments began to feel uneasy. Dependence, for any empire, is always the first sign of vulnerability. Some ministers began to wonder to themselves in hushed voices, how far does this power extend? And who guarantees that they will remain on our side? At the same time, technology was changing. The arrival of telegraph in the following decades, this dramatically reduced the advantage that had made the Rothschilds unbeatable: speed. Now, any government could transmit messages in minutes, without private messengers, without exclusive codes. The family's most valuable currency, information, was beginning to be democratized. It was as if the world had discovered a shortcut to break the invisible monopoly they had built. And while this was happening, a new kind of power was emerging: stronger nation-states, with organized central banks and more robust bureaucratic systems. Instead of running to a family dynasty for emergency loans, many governments began to look for ways to finance themselves internally. This did not eliminate the Rothschilds, but it reduced the space for them to reign supreme. The combination of telegraph, emerging central banks, and rising nationalisms created something the family couldn't control: political competition. And politics, unlike finance, is unpredictable. Still, the family didn't fall, they adapted. But that feeling of absolute, almost mythical strength that would mark the legend of the heist that built an empire was beginning to lose its boundaries. And it is in this climate of change, uncertainty, and reinvention that the story moves towards its most sensitive point: the moment when the world realizes that no empire, not even a financial empire, is eternal. Even with the emergence of competitors, the modernization of financial systems, and technological advances diminishing their advantages, something unexpected happened to the Rothschilds. The more their power was distributed, the more the popular imagination transformed them into giants. 19th and early 20th century Europe was obsessed with stories of invisible influence, market manipulation, and shadow power. And, among all the possible names, none seemed to fit as perfectly as Rothschild. They didn't just finance wars, they financed stories. They became unwitting protagonists of rumors, sensationalist headlines, and theories that spanned generations. And this, curiously, amplified the symbolic power of the family. Bankers, politicians, and even kings were fully aware that dealing with the Rothschilds meant entering a game where prestige and reputation were worth as much as gold. It no longer mattered only what they actually did, but what the world believed they did. It was a type of influence that no government could regulate and that no central bank could copy. Over time, this aura took on a life of its own. Exaggerated stories about financial espionage, the family controlling gold prices, or global manipulations began to emerge. Many were complete fantasies, others had a basis far removed from reality. But all had the same effect: to reinforce the idea that the Rothschild dynasty had created a model of power that did not depend entirely on weapons, territories, or armies, but on information, timing, and capital. And what's most fascinating is that, while Europe was inventing grandiose myths, the Rothschilds were doing something much simpler and more strategic: professionalization. They created internal structures, divided family branches among countries, and established operating standards that became a benchmark for modern banks. While the world saw them as magicians, they worked as engineers. Ultimately, this contrast between the inescapable myth and the silent practice ended up raising an even deeper question: what was more powerful? The financial reality they built, or the legend the world created around them? And it is precisely at this point, where fact and myth intertwine, that the final chapter of this story comes to life: how a dynasty spans centuries, wars, and revolutions and remains, to this day, one of the most influential in money history. The truth is that no financial empire is born mythical. What is born is the fact, and only then comes the legend. In the case of the Rothschilds, it all began with a single event, Waterloo in 1815. The rumor that Nathan Rothschild knew the outcome before everyone else and quickly profited millions spread through the streets of London. It was too compelling a story to die there. Within a few years, newspapers, pamphlets, and coffee shop conversations transformed a clever market move into an almost supernatural narrative. In the first 5 years, even then, the name Rothschild carried an unsettling allure, admiration mixed with fear. But legends don't survive on rumors alone, they thrive on repetition. And that's exactly what happened in the following 10 to 20 years while Europe rebuilt itself and faced new crises. Who was always there? Financing governments, stabilizing currencies, lending gold, and influencing international negotiations? The Rothschilds. They didn't create this perception, but they didn't dispel it either. Every successful operation became evidence. Every signed contract became fuel. That's how history works. When people want to believe there's a force behind the chaos, they build one. The process is complete when history ceases to be history and becomes culture. 50 years after Waterloo. By then, the Rothschilds were no longer just bankers. They were characters. Archetypes. The men who control governments. The family that decides wars. The invisible hand of the European economy. None of this came from official documents. It was the people. It was the sensationalist newspapers. It was rivals exaggerating their influence to justify personal defeats. It was Europe itself projecting its fears onto a surname that represented power. And when that point is reached, something curious always happens. The legend becomes stronger than the truth. Even when documents prove that Nathan didn't single-handedly control London's fate or that the brothers weren't as omnipotent as they seemed, the narrative was already self-sustaining. The myth became bigger than the man. And here, at the height of this collective construction, arises the question that elegantly leads to the next chapter. When a legend grows to this point, does it still serve the truth, or does it begin to serve only power? Ultimately, the story of the Rothschild heist isn't just about a rumor that traveled faster than the messengers of the time. It's about how the world chooses its myths. About how a family of brilliant but human bankers transformed, in the eyes of all of Europe, into something almost supernatural. Not because they asked for it. Not because they needed to. But because people want to believe that behind the chaos, there is someone in control. And perhaps that's the most revealing part of this whole story. Sometimes, real power isn't in the money, but in the narrative the world constructs about those who possess it. The Rothschilds understood this early on. They didn't fight the legend. They didn't directly feed it. They simply continued working while history did the rest. And, even today, more than 200 years later, millions still ask the same question. Did they really control everything, or did we create this collective fantasy? What matters, in the end, is that you learn to see beyond the easy versions. Because every great fortune has its own mythology, and every mythology, behind the glitz, hides a real structure of decisions, risks, and consequences. And that's exactly what we're doing here, unveiling the hidden side of world financial history, one piece at a time. Now tell me, what other dynasties, empires, or scandals would you like to see dissected here on Empire of Money? Leave a comment below and let's open together the doors that history has tried to keep closed. It is clear, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications, because the next chapters will unearth even bigger secrets.